Adverts for junk food, which are targeted at children, could be banned to try to tackle the problem of obesity. The Committee of Advertising Practice has launched a public consultation on proposals to limit where they can be shown in newspapers, magazines and online. The bar would bring the regulations in line with television ads. So should adverts for unhealthy food aimed at children be made illegal, or should we trust parents to take decisions for their families? Let's talk about this now with Dr. Ellie, Director of the Centre for Parenting Culture Studies at the University of Kent, and Liat, Hughes, Joshi, parenting journalist and author of Raising Children, the Primary Years. Very good morning to you both. And Dr. Ellie, let's start with you. Should we ban adverts which highlight sugary foods for kids?
No, I don't, and I think this is symptomatic of the ban-happy times we live in. I mean, this proposal is being made in full admission and recognition that there's no reason to think that children eat what they do or have the bodies the size that they do because of advertising. That's well known. And what's being said really is, well, we might as well do this because we can, because people involved in a lobby, a vociferous lobby, which is really hostile to the food industry, wants them banned, and there's no reason for it. And I think that my concern about this, I mean, I've got no interest in the food industry particularly. What I'm concerned about is that this lobby that's now so hostile towards food manufacturers and what they call bad foods and junk foods is actually also has some very negative attitudes towards parents in the way it looks at things, and some very negative attitudes towards families. I think parents and families, vast swathes of whom perfectly happily give their children food produced by manufacturers, from formula milk through convenience foods, through McDonald's, through Cocoa Pops, are now routinely patronised as uneducated victims of the food industry, or actually are now viewed with pretty much open hostility and disgust. The way parents who take their kids to McDonald's are talked about is really characterised frequently by disgust, and I think that they need to back off and leave it up to parents to raise their kids in the way that they want to, including feeding them. I also think that these people need to have a good look in the mirror in relation to the situation that we now have with kids who are increasingly preoccupied with what they're eating, increasingly worried about what their bodies look like. Everybody wants to blame skinny models and celebrities, but I think that this lobby is actually culpable, and they should have a good think about what they're doing to screw up children through their relentless pathologisation of perfectly okay foods. There's nothing wrong with these foods.
Well, Liat, Joshi, Hughes, a fairly vocal attack there on this idea. What do you think? Is it really going to make any difference banning ads on sugary treats?
Look, at the end of the day, we can look out there for evidence of whether these adverts actually influence children's eating habits and families' purchasing habits. And it is hard to find a very firm link between the two. But I don't for a minute believe that the food industry would be spending millions advertising to targeting children if it didn't work, if it didn't influence what we buy as families. So, I think this is a good measure. I think that we have a huge, significant obesity problem at all age groups in this country. A third of children who leave school are either overweight or obese, and the obesity issue is costing the NHS £5.1 billion a year to deal with. So we have to do something.
Lost you. Yeah.
Go on, Dr. Lee.
Sorry, I just lost you there for a minute, but I think what's been demonstrated here exactly what I'm saying. There is just a ban-happy attitude, which basically says, even though we've got no reason for saying this at all, we just don't like these adverts very much, we don't like parents who give their kids these food, we don't like what kids' bodies look like, so we're going to ban things. And
Dr. Lee,
I just think it's really out of order.
But the point that Liat, Hughes, Joshi was making is about the obesity crisis, and it is a crisis that we have in this country, with a third of children leaving.
I think there's a moral panic. I don't think that there is a crisis. Anybody who writes sensibly about this should say we should use the word crisis lightly, because when people start talking about a crisis,
okay, but it's a problem.
Really, all they're doing is dramatising and exaggerating a situation. And I am quite genuinely much more concerned about the fact that lots of very little kids now are really bothered about being too fat. You know, you're making them really worried or concerned about what their bodies look like. I think that's a really unhealthy thing to do to kids.
Liat, Hughes, Joshi, is it a point that we are becoming obsessed with our children's weight? My 5-year-old son got a letter home saying that he was overweight because of his BMI. He's not overweight, and actually we're bringing up a generation, possibly, as you heard there from Dr. Lee, of parents and families who are so obsessed with their children's weight, they become so focused on it and restrictive that it's actually detrimental to them in the long term.
It's about balance, and yes, you can go too far the other way, but at the same time, we've got plenty of families who actually are not doing anything to stop their children eating deeply unhealthy foods. So, you know, we have to take action because parents aren't. They're not saying, no, you can't eat those crisps or chocolate. We can't rely on some parents to do this.
What do you think?
The fundamental premise is completely wrong, and I really object to the unscientific and nonsensical language that's now used to talk about food. Good food, bad food, junk food. I mean, what a silly term is that? Food is not junk. Food is not bad. That includes crisps, biscuits, McDonald's, breakfast cereals. They are neither junk nor bad. They're just food. And anybody who is scientifically... No, it's not bad. It's not bad unless it's gone...
Let me just ask Liat Hughes, Joshi.
Bad?
Listen,
you're obviously not a very scientific person.
OK, let me come in here because Liat Hughes, Joshi, all of the junk food, if that's what you call it, it was all around when we were kids. You know, I would have eaten Cocoa Pops and biscuits all day long if I could have done, you know, and it wasn't necessarily down to my parents, although they were strict, to say no. Actually, you have to learn when you become, you know, an adult eventually, self-control.
Yeah, we do, and parents ideally need to be teaching children or encouraging children to have more self-control. But actually, that's not always happening. There are a third of children who are obese or overweight. It's a fact. That is not me making it up, and we need to be doing something to help those parents and to help those families ensure that their children don't grow up to add to those obesity statistics. And to say these sorts of foods are not bad is just quite frankly ridiculous. Of course, if you only have them once a month.
Wait, when you say bad, what do you mean?
Look, if those foods contribute to a child ending up overweight or obese, then clearly that is bad for their health. The food in itself, if you only have it once a month, sure, I accept that it's not the end of the world. It is something that clearly contributes. Well, frankly, you're being quite patronising. Clearly, there is a link between unhealthy food and children being overweight, and that being unhealthy for those children. And, you know, that's irrefutable.
It's not irrefutable. There's nothing that's irrefutable. That's a silly thing to say.
Dr. Lee, it is a fact.
Your statistics are irrefutable. So the definitions that are used to measure obesity and overweight are completely refutable, and they are a subject of significant debate. For example, body mass index and the measure of it, as you'd know if you read stuff, is subject to debate, and the construction of these statistics is a matter of contest and debate, number one. Number two, the way in which we understand nutrition and the science of nutrition is a science, and the concepts that you are using have departed very, very considerably to any sensible mobilisation of scientific concepts. Once people start talking about food in moralised categories, which are the categories you're using, good and bad are not scientific categories, they're moral categories. Something is good, something is bad. It's not a language that comes from science.
Dr. Lee.
That's what you're doing. You are involved in the moralisation of forms of behaviour, and it's got nothing to do with nutrition, it's got nothing to do with food, nothing to do with a proper understanding of problems, and this is really a discussion that has got completely out of control.
But Dr. Lee,
I think as a result it's having very negative consequences for families and children.
Dr. Lee, isn't that the language that we use when we talk to our children? We say, you can't have that it's unhealthy, it's not good for you. The two are kind of equated. It is the language that we use, isn't it?
And I think it's a problematic language. I think it's a moralised language which doesn't help children understand anything about nutrition. It doesn't help them understand anything about the science of food. It doesn't help them understand anything about the components that go into diet.
OK, sure, but when you're talking to a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, a 5-year-old,
I don't use that language. I don't call McDonald's bad.
What do you use when you're talking to a toddler, for example?
It's food. It's some chips and a burger.
But do
I mean,
you?
if
but
they're,
if you had to explain
interested,
to them,
if they're interested at an appropriate point in their development in having a discussion about the science of nutrition, then you can talk to them about the science of nutrition, which means talking about calories,
but if you're trying to
protein,
instill values,
carbohydrate, vitamins.
if you're trying to instill values in a young child, how do you talk to them if it doesn't
Well, okay,
put
so
a moral
values,
judgment, if that's
right.
what you're calling it, on it?
Okay, so now this is interesting because values are about morality. Values are a moral concept, and it's to do with a moral framework about the way we want to live our lives and the way that we want to go on with each other. And there is a huge swathe of sociology which is very interested in food and food habits as part of moral norms within communities. And what all of that sociology recognises is that pleasure, enjoyment, joy and community are probably the single most important things that go along with food in a moral sense. And I think that what's going on now with the way that we've come to talk about food in a very kind of pathologised negative language, which takes all of the joy and the pleasure out of it and only ever talks about food as a problem, is very, very negative.
Okay,
for
so let me
family
put
norms
that.
and for
Let me put that to
community
Liat
norms.
Hughes. Joshi, as a parenting author, do you accept that actually we're putting moral judgments on our food and we need to use different language to educate our children?
I think the idea of standing there in the supermarket when your 4-year-old is asking to buy a multi-pack of extremely unhealthy, they are unhealthy, chocolate bars, and having a great scientific and moral debate with them is just
I didn't say
unrealistic.
that.
We need to
You're
talk to
making things up
parents.
now.
At the end of the day, these foods are unhealthy. There is no...
Asserting that. What does that mean? What do you mean unhealthy?
If you eat too many
Why
of
is
them...
chocolate unhealthy?
Because if you eat too much of it, you gain weight, and then you can have health problems. It's simple, it's common sense.
You know what, ladies,
but the relation between overweight and health is very complicated.
Okay, it is. It's a complicated debate, and we will have to leave it there. Very interesting to talk to you both, though. Dr. Ellie Lee, Liat Hughes, Joshi. Do let us know, our audience, what you think. Tweet me at Sky Samantha. What do you think? A very fiery debate there. What do you think about whether the food you give your children, the names you call it, unhealthy or otherwise, is the correct terminology? Is it educating them or confusing them? Let us know what you think.